And we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. I'm really thrilled to be here, as always, with Loretta Chase and Susan Holloway Scott. This is our fourth time in talking about the two nerdy history girls being back together for conversation and history and research and just fun. So before I get to them, I just wanted to say I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And also both Loretta and Susan agreed to let us share this program with some other libraries. So I, of course, welcome patrons from Ashland, but also from Clinton, Stowe, and Rockport. I hope you have a great time tonight.
Oh, that's cool.
It is, you know, when libraries come together, magic.
Yeah.
And we have a special guest tonight. I believe it's Trixie.
It's Trixie who just cannot resist Zoom calls. So if you see, it's not a cow going by, it's a black and white cat. There's her tail. She'll get bored and leave at some point.
We've been enjoying Trixie, I think every time.
Every time.
So,
She will, every Zoom thing I do, she's there.
Maybe,
right?
maybe Trixie's the third nerdy history girl.
She is.
So anyways, you guys are here because you know Loretta and Susan are the two nerdy history girls. They had a blog. They are about researching historical information and artifacts to write their books. Susan is a historical fiction writer, and Loretta is, of course, historical romance and has written some of my very favorite books. So we will just get right started. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A. If you want to chat with each other, feel free to do that in the chat. If you put questions in the Q&A, I will moderate them to our authors. So Loretta, Susan, I went back and forth about how I want to start this conversation, as you know, and I was between like transportation and chamber pots. So I'm gonna go. I'm gonna start off with transportation because I think chamber pots will sort of come into the conversation at some point there. So I'm interested in what you know about how your characters got around back in the day. What was like hard and what was easy, like what was like fancy, and how did the regular people get around?
Well, regular people mostly walked because that was all they could afford. And it kind of astounds me how much walking people did. But people who could afford a horse would ride a horse, or if they could afford to keep a carriage and horses, that would be the preference. In the time period I'm writing, the roads are much better than, say, in the actual Regency, the very early 1800s. So they could get from one place to another fairly quickly compared to what it had been just maybe 10 years earlier. It's pretty astonishing to me that you've got mail coaches that are going 10, 12, even 14 miles an hour. Of course, it's really hard on the poor horses, but a lot of that is due to the fact that the roads improved.
Mm-hmm.
Not that the vehicles improved, but the roads themselves.
Mm-hmm. So what caused that in that short time span for the roads to be improved? What was
they were mostly, you know, it's like dirt roads, basically, or some kind of gravelly thing that was never maintained, you know, and each section was supposed to be the responsibility of that particular municipality or village or whatever. And then macadam came along with this scheme for making the roads smoother by using stones mixed with some kind of, I forget what it was, some kind of a tar. Susan, do you know remember what it is exactly? The mixture they use.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyway, so they had smoother roads. I don't want to get into terrible detail here because it could get really boring, but the roads were smoother. They were macadamized. So all the King's Highway, for instance, that where the major coach lines were going, you had very smooth traveling compared to what it had been, say, 10 or 20 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm writing in the wild and woolly North America in the 18th century, 1700s, and there is no such thing as paved roads between cities or anything. For the most part, if you had a choice, it was much easier, faster to go by water. whether in rivers or up and down the coast. Though, of course, then you're dependent on the wind and the weather and all this stuff. But there are some, by the Revolution, there are some roads going north and south between the important cities, but they're still in terrible shape. And if you have a carriage, I remember when Loretta and I were in Colonial Williamsburg, some of the carriage people told us that having a carriage with a coach and six in North America at that time would be the same today as having a private jet. There aren't very many. It was just for the very wealthy. And part of that is that they're almost, where if you had this thing, where was it going to go? There just weren't roads that were going to be appropriate for it. So most people, as Loretta said, would walk. They would ride on single horses. This was a country of great horsemanship, just like England. People really wanted to prided themselves on how well they could ride. But I would say they're definitely behind England in the state of roads at that point. But it always sort of surprises me reading about how long it takes to move or to travel from one place to another, that now you just bop on 95 and you just go.
Yeah.
Although you lost a piece of 95, didn't you, recently?
Yes. Yes, in North Philadelphia, yeah. Yeah, the conspiracy theories are flying about that one. But
well, maybe we're back to the 1700s and people have to stay where they're at.
well, the big, just for a second, the big problem with that is that the people who live, it's an enormous headache for the people who live in the area who have to go through other roads. But that was the main thoroughfare for all the like delivery trucks, tractor trailers, and UPS and FedEx, and they can't go on the side streets. So I don't know how that's going to work. It's going to be out for at least a year. So
Oh, wow.
Anyway.
It's
All right,
amazing.
back to the 18th century.
No, but that's actually part of my question is about transportation, is that, obviously it would affect the way you write your stories, because people can't just get up and go and visit somebody in another town far away. And, in a lot of romances, especially, in 1 minute they're London, or like one page they're in London and the next they're at Gretna Green, but it's really not that easy, right? So
No.
how do you work with that, given knowing that people cannot get around that quickly?
It's part of the story, and that's one of the great things one of the things I love about writing a road romance, because they're going to be on the road for a long time, depending on where they're going, and they're going to they have to make a lot of stops, because you either have to change horses or you have to rest the horses. It's not like a car, just fill it up with gasoline and then you can go on to the next stage. No.
Yeah, this when people talk about, we just rode the horse, he rode from here to there, and it's like, well, he didn't just do that. Horses are not like cars; they can only go a certain distance. Right.
I mean, the horse, when they would do the posting thing, where they're riding in they rent this carriage and they rent a rider along with it, and it's only going about 8 or 10 miles back and forth. So the horse is taking you from point A to point B, which is maybe 8 or 10 miles apart. And then the next stage, you have to change horses. And that horse that you came in on is going back to the place it came from. And that's something so I know that my characters are going to have all this time to be together. I know they're going to have to stop at an inn. I know that they can have an accident. So it's just like filled with potential for a love
It gives
story.
you a lot. And also that delay of time, knowing that it's going to take time, you can have all sorts of, something happened, but nobody learns about it for another week. Or in my case, something happens in London, they don't hear about it for 2 months. I mean, then there's things that continue to happen and go on that would have been affected by that news. So you use it as a fun plot thing rather than as a hindrance. I think it's sort of things.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, the single bed at the inn. I mean, it's a classic.
Right.
For a reason.
I know. And in romance, you can ignore the fact that would probably be like 4 other people in that bed with you, but that you didn't know who kept their boots on,
We got the gross part.
Yeah, we leave that out.
Well, we're gonna talk about it. There's a good like filthy question in the Q&A that I'm gonna get to. But I wanted to know about the different modes of transportation, because especially in romance, you hear obviously about the horses, but then you hear about the barouche and the phaeton and so like, what is that? Like, what are the levels of baroucherie that happened back in the day? Is it about money? What is it?
It's about money, but it's a level of comfort. And it's, I think Susan had used a very good example. I hadn't remembered that from Colonial Williamsburg about someone owning a carriage is sort of like someone owning a private jet. That's how rich these people were. So if someone has several carriages, they are stupendously wealthy. And I guess what I do with the vehicles is I use the vehicle that's best adapted to the scene. I might use an open vehicle depending on what I want to happen. If I want characters to be private, I use a closed vehicle. And then I have books telling me what's what. But the thing that we always have to keep in mind is there was no assembly line. So you can say, oh, it's a phaeton. Well, yes, but what exactly did it look like? Well, it would depend on what the owner wanted and asked for. So they're not all going to be the same. You can't say, and you can't necessarily recognize it unless it's, in the book explaining to you what it is.
Yeah, and buying the vehicle is really just the beginning. You have to have a place. You have to either have a stable somewhere on your property or rent it. If you live in a city, you have to have your horses, your teams of horses, usually more than one. If you have a big carriage, you have to have servants who will drive it, who will take care of your horses, who will be your footmen, who perhaps a riding postilion. So you have to have a staff that's just devoted to your transportation. So I think when Loretta's talking about different levels of transportation, you can have somebody who has just a one horse gig that they just take care of themselves. It's just like a little cart almost, that they can look after the horse and stable it and stuff in their barn or whatever. And they don't have to have the big grand thing. So there are different levels too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And plus, somebody that's a farmer might need something very different, obviously, than a duke, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, think about Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. That one of the daughters wants a horse to ride someplace in bad weather, but the horses have to do something on the farm, so they're not available. And he's a gentleman. He has some money, but he's not at that level of wealth where he has spare horses.
Yeah, and there's also when they break, you're always hearing about, they thought they were going to make this great time and go from hither to yon or whatever, and then they break an axle or the wheel comes off or the springs break. There's one whole series where Martha Washington is trying to get from Mount Vernon up to see George in the north, and she has to stay in Philadelphia for a while because all the springs are broken on her carriage, and her son was supposed to have taken care of that before she left, and he didn't, which sounded very familiar. But you just can't, it's unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen, just like now, but there's no speedy muffler shop or something that you can stop by and get taken care of. With some of the bigger things, the more important thing, you might not even have a wheelwright nearby. You have to wait until the part comes from someplace else.
Right. I always think about that scene or that story of Martha Washington as she saves the portrait of George Washington, and she has this cart, right, that she carries all this stuff out from the White House when it's burning.
That's not Martha, that's Dolly Madison.
Oh, one of them. Sorry.
Yeah, well, no, that's okay, because George and Martha never lived in the White House. It wasn't finished till after they were out of office. After George was out of office. So that's Dolly Madison saving it from the British during the War of 1812.
Did she save
but
it?
It was a portrait of George. So
yeah. Okay. All right. So
George was there in theory.
But thank goodness she had a cart, right? With a working horse.
Well, yeah, I think she had servants do it. I think she told them, get that down and save it. I can't really see Dolly doing it herself.
But it was her idea.
But I don't know. I wasn't there. So
some days I feel like I might have been. But I have lots of questions about this, but Susan, Donna wants to know who is the gentleman in the miniature you're wearing?
Some guy. He's not, let's see, how close can I get? Well, I'll have to unhook him. I don't know. He's some handsome young soldier ready to break hearts in a Jane Austen.
Oh,
But we don't know. Most of the miniatures don't ever have names connected to them. It's like snapshots. Nobody knows. I cannot see. There he is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, he's cute.
I'll put him on my
look at that.
Facebook page tomorrow with a
Smart.
real picture.
Oh,
See, he's
He's-
real though, because there's his hair in the back too.
What?
Most of them have, they're like love, either memorial pieces or they're love tokens. This, I'm sure, was a love token, or to his mother before he went to war. And they usually have the person's hair on the back, either woven or braided on the back. So that's his hair in there.
So we
Whoever
could
he
Jurassic
was.
Park him.
Do I what?
We could Jurassic Park him, like, clone him.
If you want to. Here.
He is kind of
But yeah, I know
Cute.
that the hair things really freak out my kids too. They go on, but you're carrying someone else's DNA with you. And it's like, yeah, well, that's such is life or death.
Okay, so back to my transportation, moving towards chamber pot conversation. So,
Yeah.
so
we
as-
want to talk about, we have things we want to say about stays and what was the other thing? And breastfeeding too?
oh, yeah. We need to talk
We've
about
got
that
other
too.
things too.
Yeah.
So let me finish my line of thought in that, we read about people sort of like emptying their chamber pots out their windows, and the gullies and stuff not being that great. So like, because people have to walk almost everywhere, how do they keep their feet and the bottoms of their clothes clean?
Very carefully.
Yeah, you lift stuff up. Women's will wear the pattens, which are like wooden overshoes or just a heavier fabric overshoes to protect them and lift them above it. A lot of times the clothes have or the dresses are they're not dragging in the street as much as you think, at least in my time period, but they also will have like an inner hem of a different fabric that sort of protects the, it's like a rougher thing that can be replaced. It will help protect the silk. But mainly if you've got fancy clothes, you're not walking. So, and if you're poor, you're short, or not poor, if you're more middling, whatever, your skirts are shorter, so they're not dragging. Loretta?
If you're rich, the carriage is going to stop right where you're going to be getting off, and you're going on to the pavement rather than walking on the street.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've had to remind myself about was the street sweepers, because the streets of London are there are millions of horses, thousands of horses going back and forth, and so they're pretty filthy. And so you have these people who are sweeping constantly, making paths across a street, and that's where someone who's walking is going to walk. They're supposed to tip the street sweepers, but they don't always do that.
Yeah, interesting. But it was a thing where people threw chamber pots like this stuff right out their windows, or did they not? Am I just making that up?
No, I think it's earlier.
Earlier, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think by the time that we're writing, there are privies in the backyard and you go and dump it back in there. Then the night soil man comes to get it.
Yes.
In the city. Yeah, somebody comes and cleans out your privy and stuff, but I don't think I would imagine maybe in some of the poorer neighborhoods, people may be just throwing things out the window or throwing them into the center gutter of the street.
Yeah.
I think by later, it's a little bit more, slightly more refined.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that when you have diseases striking places like London, they tend to be in the poorer neighborhoods, because there's the streets aren't as clean. There's a lot of filth and the water gets contaminated, so people are getting sick. That was like one of the things with the cholera.
Wow. Okay. This is a little bit on the Alta asks. It's a bit much, which is fine. Speaking of chamber pots, what did people in the late 18th century, early 19th century do to clean themselves after using a chamber pot? Was there water to splash on themselves with their hands? Do they use rags? because historical romance often features people having lots of sex in lots of different ways, and it makes you wonder about hygiene.
All right. Well, it depends on the person. But you have to remember too that you're changing your linen. If a woman, it's a shift. If a man, your shirt is long enough and goes, pulls between your legs and serves as basically underpants. So you change your linen every day, and a lot of times you would just kind of use the hem of your garment if that's all you had. If you're out behind a bush or something, that's kind of what you're going to do, and you're going to change at the end of the day. So do it. But yeah, I'd say rags if you're posh, I guess.
Are pages from like newspapers or books or whatever, old books get torn up and used in that way, old magazines, that was, and that continued well into the 20th century in this country, certainly.
You do
Wow.
come up with good questions, Mina.
That was from an attendee.
Wow.
I just read it very, dramatically. Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because like in Europe also, like they're right now, like they have the bidets, whereas in America, toilet paper is become, huge, big thing, but that's now. So I'm wondering, as you said, was it different back in the day? What was happening, in Europe versus the US or other places in the world?
I think that the upper class French are using bidets in the 18th century, because there's lots of sort of naughty paintings of women straddling the bidet looks like a little, I don't know, it's a little four-legged piece of furniture with a porcelain bowl in it, and you would straddle it and splash yourself. And this was a big erotic thing to paint. So there are paintings by like Francois Boucher of women sitting there looking very coy as they clean themselves up. But that's not going to be widely used. And I can also see it, some people being sort of suspicious, some English speaking people being suspicious because it's French. Maybe
Yes.
But again, I know that Martha Washington had one when the French ambassador to America came, when he was visiting the Capitol, and then when he served in the Capitol, and then when he went back, he just sold off everything rather than shipping it back to France. And one of the things that she got is a bidet, and it's in Mount Vernon now. So she was forward thinking, I guess.
Or backwards.
Or whatever.
This is being weird. So going back to the sex question though, because does that mean that because people weren't able to be as clean maybe as we think it needs to be done now, that people didn't necessarily have all the various forms of sex that we had, that people talk about in the romance books?
All the different kinds of what? Of
sex. We're still talking about sex.
And so
she had mentioned, Alta had mentioned particularly oral sex. So like, is that something that wasn't as
people are going to do? They're
yeah,
not going to worry about it. They're going to do whatever they're going to do.
yeah.
I mean, you can't say that they didn't invent, but that something was only invented in the 1980s or something. People have been doing the same stuff forever.
I mean, look at the Kama Sutra.
I mean, it's just there's all the Roman mosaics and there's erotica all the way through, and people have always been inventive.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they let hygiene stop them and what we perceive as hygiene.
Right. They're not necessarily going to take a shower after they have sex, but they've got a bowl, they've got a pitcher with water, they can clean themselves off. There are towels there. And again, it depends on the level of wealth, what facilities you have at your disposal, and you use what's available.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is one of our favorite things we say, is that the people of the past were not dirty and gross, and we're so much better because we take showers twice a day. They were clean, but it was a different kind of cleaning. They didn't do full immersion baths. Very few people did that because it's a lot of labor and water to bring the water in buckets to your tub to heat it. I mean, that's a whole, again, it's a wealthy thing. But people were clean. They prided themselves on being clean and smelling good. And it isn't this, ooh, they were all so dirty. It just isn't like that. We're not superior now just because we have a shower.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we talked about this also last time, that we have this misperception. So it's just, I guess, but that's for me, like, that's because I've been reading romance for so long. And in romance, they do bathe really regularly. They do have, like at all levels, they do bathe
Yeah.
really regularly. And you're like, is that true?
Well, it kind of depended. I mean, Beau Brummel bathed every single day. But apparently that was something a little different for people. They didn't necessarily, as Susan said, they didn't fully immerse themselves in a bath every single day, but he did. But most people, and again, it all depends on your level of wealth. What can you afford? And I think most people, and of course there are always exceptions, it depends. It depends. Most people were as clean as their means allowed them to be.
Because I mean, you're judged on your cleanliness, and most people had at least a change of shirt, a change of shift, so that they could change and wash those clothes. And by the 18th century, you're getting physicians and medical experts saying that it's really important to be clean, that you really should do it. And it isn't just that it will make you more gentlemanly or whatever, but it's healthier
Yes.
to be clean. So as I said, they don't do full bath immersions or immersion bath. They don't take showers, but they do what we would think of as sponge baths. So they're clean.
Yeah.
I mean, there's people that are dirty today. Just ride the subway in the summer.
Yes, absolutely. So people in the chat and the Q&A are asking about what did women do when they had their periods, in terms of not just cleanliness, but in fact, like, actually, did they use like rags, or what did they do? And this is something that is almost never spoken about in romance. So, that's an interesting thing as well. Is it just because it's annoying? What, like, you don't want to, that it's
It's not very romantic.
Yeah,
It's rags. I mean,
rags.
Yeah.
But also bear in mind that women didn't have as many periods as they do today, generally speaking, because they were pregnant more.
Oh.
Let's think of Queen Charlotte. How many children did she have? 15? She was like pregnant for most of her adult, a whole section of her adult life. And then she stops having children. Well, it's menopause. She doesn't have a period. I mean, there were women that probably never had a period, or maybe had one period. They're getting married when they're 18 years old. They get their first menstruation occurs when they're like 16, 17, 18. We're
much older than girls now.
We're much younger. So it wasn't, so there were a great many women who very rarely would have a period.
Wow. I didn't really put that together, but yes, 13 kids, you wouldn't really have time.
Well, and there's probably, when you read about the women, not just the queen, but other people who, these women that are constantly pregnant, those are usually, they just make a record of the live births. They don't talk about all the times that they miscarry after 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever. And a lot of times they don't even realize that they're pregnant, because they don't have all the high-tech stuff now. They're much vaguer about counting weeks and counting days and stuff. So I would imagine too, there's a lot of women that are pregnant don't even realize it. I don't have my period now.
Susan says that she thought that the heavy use of perfume, or our understanding of that, was to cover up odor from lack of cleanliness, but that doesn't seem to be the case from what you're saying.
I think you could use it that way, but I don't think that, I think that the things like the, I can't remember the word for it, the little, you carry like balls and little boxes of things, is more the foul smells around you. And they also think that it's preserving you from germs. You don't want to breathe the germy air. And I think it's more from that. And I'm sure, as Loretta said, the streets are full of all sorts of nasty stuff. So the streets smell bad, but not necessarily the people. I think that perfume thing, again, there are people that today that will do things like, they smell bad, so they'll spray more perfume, more cologne, they'll spray on deodorant after the fact, and
Well, yeah, I think that would be the case then. I mean, they also, again, you're dealing with how can you afford it?
yeah.
What can you afford? And you could make your own scents at home, and depending on what you had access to. So if you lived on a farm, it might be easier to make scented things because you have the materials there if you have the time to bother with that. But I would think, again, it would really depend on the people. Some people drown themselves in scent and some people don't. I have read things about, like the French court, but I'm learning to take that stuff with a grain of salt. Who's reporting this? Where's the information come from? Is it someone from another country who's mocking the French by saying that they're filthy? Just in the same way, maybe someone who's French is mocking the English because they're filthy. The exaggeration with that kind of whatever, xenophobia or whatever it is. So I'm really not sure about that thing with the heavy scent,
And the 19th century writes all sorts of goofy things about the 18th century earlier too.
And Susan and I run across this a lot. People basing their information on things that were written by Victorians and that are very much colored by that of evangelism and some other aspects of what was going on at that time. And they paint a skewed picture of what was going on, say, in the Regency and earlier time periods.
No, I think that's totally true. And as for the scent, just sort of backtrack a little bit, almost all of the cookbooks of that time, there's always a section somewhere in there talking about, beauty things. And it's how to make basically your own rouge and your own scent and things like that. There are recipes in the back. So I think a lot of women and probably teenage girls were playing around with a lot of that at home. Mm-hmm. They didn't necessarily have to go to a fancy shop. I think that was a home thing you could do too.
Yeah. When they have the books that were teaching maids how to do their jobs have those formulas in them. I use them because I want to make sure that whatever scent someone is wearing would have been available to someone at that time.
Oh,
because there were limited choices.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Limited by geography, like where they live, like if they were in London versus the country.
I just mean that you're not going to have something like Chanel No. 5.
Yeah.
So you're going to have some blends. They tend to be herbal blends,
right? Some
kind of flower essence and herbal blends.
Yeah, my would guess too is that they probably weren't as strong as the things are now, because I think a lot of perfume now is augmented with modern chemicals to make it stronger, last longer. And I suspect it probably didn't.
That's a good point.
I don't know. I'm just shooting my mouth off.
Shoot away.
Yeah.
So actually this comes right into what you said that you wanted to talk about was stays and breastfeeding and things like that, because the thing that we hear about as readers is that, the stays, the corsets were so tight that they could actually mess somebody up, internally. So they could, how do they actually have healthy births? And then on top of that, who breastfed? Was it just the poor people? Was it everybody? How does that work? So let's start with the first part.
Do you want me to start, Susan, or you want to start?
I'll start, and I'm just going to do a sidetrack to Queen Charlotte, which is, I know Loretta hasn't watched it yet. I watched it. I watched it twice. I thought I liked it much better than the other Bridgerton things. But they almost lost me in the very beginning because Charlotte's going to go off to marry the English king. And there's this whole long, stupid scene with her in the carriage going on about, I can't move, I'm being stabbed to death by my whalebone corset. And I understand why they're doing that, because it's establishing her as a spunky girl who doesn't like corset things. And it's appealing to modern viewers who have all those preconceptions about corsets are terrible. So if she doesn't like it, she must be like me. So I can understand that from a storytelling point of view, but it's not accurate. I mean, to begin with, she would have been wearing stays reinforced with whalebone since she was a child. Since she was like a toddler, they would have put her in them. They were not uncomfortable in the 18th century because they're, for one thing, they can't do super tight lacing. The whole idea of them at that point is to shape you, not to constrict you. They can't do tight lacing until, was it, Loretta, like 1830s, when they invent metal eyelets. They can't pull them tight enough because the eyelets are just worked with thread. So you'll never get a really tight wasp waist in the earlier corsets. And the whole thing behind it is to make you, assume a certain position that they regarded as healthier. It was considered more elegant. It made you stand up straighter and you wore your clothes better, but it wasn't to constrict you. And Charlotte would never have dreamed of saying any of those things, and her clothes wouldn't have hurt her either. Okay.
And let's talk about whalebone.
What do you want to say about whalebone?
Well, why don't you explain what whalebone is? Because people think it's bones.
No, isn't it like the mouth, like the?
Yeah, it's baleen. It's like a fibrous thing. It's very, very flexible. It's not stiff. It's not like sticks.
It's not a rigid thing. It gives. It whips around. But
it is from a whale.
It is from a whale, but it's from the whale's mouth. It's like this. We're not good about this.
I can't remember that.
We're not good biology people, but it's like when the whale is swimming along and wants to eat stuff, it sort of filters.
Right, whale baleen.
Filters everything out.
Baleen.
There's probably
Thank
somebody
you.
saying
Filters the
baleen
krill.
filters
Right.
their krill, says Lisa.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
So
I
why
don't know
was
why
it
it's
called?
called the bone. I don't
Know
know.
why it's called bone.
Well, they talk about baleen more than the bone. I don't know. We don't
I
have.
don't
We
know
don't,
why they call whale
Like
bone.
who are they, like that came up with it, whalebone versus the actual, like it's just as you explained, I've never heard it explained that way.
as
Who
what
came-
bone?
Yeah, why?
I don't know. Maybe it could be the people buying it didn't know any better, and here was this product, and they just assumed it was bone. I don't know. I don't know. Marketing
it's
sounded better.
Yeah, it's one of those things. That's what they called it.
Yeah.
And they didn't, necessarily. And
Yeah,
I mean,
it's just
people
everybody
buying it might
called it
not know
that,
what
but
it was.
Oh,
I think
interesting.
I don't know how many people were that familiar with the whale's anatomy anyway. They just assumed it was from the whale bone. I don't
I
know.
mean, you're having a corset made or stays. You don't necessarily know what exactly is in them, right? You can see the fabric and the stitching and that sort of thing, but you don't necessarily know that what's in those those narrow channels.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's different between which comes first. So they call it did they talk about corset bones does that first, or is it the whalebone and then they start referring to it as bones? I don't know.
Something for us to look up, Susan.
Someone is saying love a cat with personality. Oh yeah. See, we got that.
So somebody said that people making stays today use plastic zip ties to mimic whalebone. So it's also not super rigid.
Yeah, though I'm not sure those would be quite, well, I don't know. I've never tried that. I know they make later on, obviously they may start making them in metal too, but it's much more rigid, but much heavier too. It makes the corset just heavier. And some 18th century people in poorer, more modest circumstances are using cane too for the bones.
Oh, interesting. So how did we get this perception that not just the whale bone, but that it was so constricting? Like, how did that happen? Like, I remember watching Gone with the Wind and being like, oh, that looks so uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, I think that was nonsense. And maybe that's what's in people's heads. Did it start earlier than that?
There's also in the late 19th century, you get the people trying to do away with corsets for health reasons. It becomes a big, we should not have this. This is hurting women. And when you see things like a lot of the propaganda about how women had and it is propaganda, had ribs removed and stuff, it's because of those 19th century corset abolitionists, I guess. What is the word? There's a term for it. Clothing. The
I think
people
they were
who
the 18th century bra burners.
well, it's 19th century, but yeah, so when you see like the pictures of, look at this woman, there's one famous photograph of like how narrow her rib cage is, and she's really, this is what corsets have done to her. And they have, excuse me, later people have said, doctors have looked at it and said, no, that woman had tuberculosis, and that's what constricted her ribs. It wasn't the corset stuff. And there's plenty of, people today who are wearing corsets and doing waist training and all that stuff, and they're not dying. I mean, I think people who are familiar with wearing corsets can tell you that. Let's see if there's anybody in here. Hey, we didn't bind feet. No, we didn't. But the corset, your midsection is pretty flexible. And I know people who do waist training and stuff, they're not permanently ruined by doing it. So
A lot of the photographs have been doctored too.
mhm.
Apparently there was like early versions of Photoshop where they would go in and just ink in to make the waist narrower. There was a blogger who showed the way it was done. That it was really fascinating, the photograph. Yeah, they just go and inked it. So
You're
make
talking about like for the fashionable, when they're showing it like a beauty of the time.
yes.
Yeah,
yes.
they do. They
Lots of-
really do. They may give them these ridiculously tiny waists. And if you look at the photographs at the, an 1890s photograph, you can see the lines where they did it, just like it's a Kardashian. I mean, it's all painted in, and they weren't really that corseted.
Which isn't to say that there weren't a few people
There's
in the
always going to be
late,
extremists.
yeah, that do that, but it's not the norm. And someone else, thank you, said dress reform. That was
That's the word. That was what we were trying to say.
yes, dress reform.
This smart group we have here.
And
Yeah,
I'm glad when
So-
we don't know it and we're stupid. Somebody in there. But I think there certainly were some valid things like all the petticoats and stuff were going to constrict your movement and things. But you also have to remember, if you're dressed a certain way from the time you were a child, you don't think of it as being this terrible, awful binding thing. You just accept it.
But were they? Because I mean, you know better, but like I think of like Muslim women, they only wear the full face covering when they turn a certain age. So and same with like boys back, you read that boys didn't wear long pants until they were a certain age. So were they wearing corsets from the time they were very young, or just like a certain age?
In the 18th century, boys and girls as toddlers even earlier are being put into stays, because the parents are always trying to do the best for their kid, and they think that that's going to help them stand up straight, have good posture. They will be accepted as ladies and gentlemen when they walk around and stand up very straight, and their lives will be perfect. So they're starting that very early. And there's little tiny stays that are like this big for babies.
yeah.
Baby
And
stays.
there's some great images. I think Susan Lasdun, I think that's her. No, that's someone else. The Drummond family. There are some images on the V&A site. These were images that were watercolors done by members of the family, and it shows young children. They're dressed like adults.
Yeah.
So they're going to be wearing corsets under the clothing. And this is 1830s, 1820s, 1830s. So it starts young.
And you're saying that boys wore them as well?
Yeah, because the same thing, they wanted them. You're trying to shape them and mold them. They stop once they're more boys, I guess. But when they're toddlers and babies, they're wearing them too. So
Because there are some books that say that like even the princes and prince and king and stuff would wear stays as they gained weight, but I don't know if that's true. Now
well, there's that, because there's Prinny, Mr. Huge Boy, and there's always been the story of this famous corset that he wore that was like 200 inches around or something, but I don't think people have actually ever seen it. I think it may be kind of apocryphal, but he was so vain that he probably did wear something like that. And I've read too that some of the military men. Those early 19th century English uniforms are so unforgiving that they wore some kind of corsetry underneath. But I don't know. I'm just.
That's not my area of expertise.
No, it's not. But and again, that maybe I'm thinking of the dandies caricatures where they're all wearing lace-up stuff. So
we actually only have a few more minutes, but I wanted to switch this into sort of the writing part of it, because you have all of this history that is true history, or as true as you can find it. How do you write so it's engaging, but still as true as you can make it? Loretta?
you want me to go for you? Either one of us.
Why don't you go first?
We will get to breastfeeding Alexis in just a second.
I think you have to always remember when you're writing the famous point of view, like whose story are you telling and what they're living, and then incorporate it through their perspective rather than stepping back. Like you would say, someone is you're describing their dress, and you can say, they were so pleased to have been able to get the silk that came from India, or a dress that was cut down from somebody else's dress or something. And she felt so good in it, or she felt dumpy in it, or something, how she feels specifically, or the sound that it makes when she walks or whatever. What you can't do is sort of step back and become, Joan Rivers on the red carpet and just do that. You'll see that sometimes where people spend a whole page just describing it. And that's like not that you're not living through the character. You're writing it for a 21st century person who's probably going to get bored by that list anyway. Mm-hmm. So you just have to figure out ways to incorporate it in so that the person reading it doesn't know that they're learning something. You have to kind of put it in with what the character thinks.
That's my favorite kind of learning. And then I can spout it off when like Jeopardy happens. I'm like, I know that.
You know that, yeah.
That's
getting into the character's head. Yeah. And who is looking at this person, and how is he or she perceiving this person? So what are they going to focus on? If it's a man, what's he focused on, and what's going on in that scene? And it's as Susan said, it's really a lot to do with picking and choosing what things you want to emphasize, enough to set the scene, enough to make the reader feel like they're there, but not so much that it feels like a travelogue or a documentary. In fiction, certainly you want to keep the reader engaged. So whatever history you use should be part of the action, part of the character. It's keeping things moving, and it's offering insights into what's happening. What's this person thinking? And it tells you something about their character. The way they dress tells you something about the character. Are they carelessly dressed? Are they fanatical about details? Those kinds of, for instance, if you have a guy who's very rough and tumble and he gets drunk all the time and he's partying, but he's really fussy about his clothes, that says something about the character. Mm-hmm. That's what I do when I'm writing the scenes. There's pages and pages and pages of research that never appear on the page, but it's in me so that I know when I'm writing the scene.
Well, one of the things I was thinking of is that I know the science fiction people talk about world building, where you're trying to make it real. And that's what we're doing. It's just we're trying to build a world that already existed. So you want to make it as real as possible for the reader and for the characters, but not write a history book.
That is really interesting, because as I said, a lot of this stuff that we talked about today is not in the fiction romance books, because I would get bored if every book had parts about the dirt and the our perception of it, or the stays or the thing. So I think that's really interesting. So you had started earlier, mentioned breastfeeding. And so I was wondering if like the stays were sturdy enough to hold up a baby.
To hold up a baby?
Yeah. So like the stays are here, right? And the baby's here. Would it be able to? No, forget it.
You're not tucking the baby in like a snuggly thing. No, but there are pictures of, or there are still surviving stays that have been adapted. They have parts cut out that are like, breastfeeding nursing bras.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So Loretta, I know Loretta was the one who was going to start this.
Well, I had read something recently online that made me hesitate. It gave me second thoughts, and it was something about women sending all the kids out to be wet nursed. And I know that people sent their children out to be wet nursed, but I didn't think it was because of their corsets. And that's one of the reasons that was given, was that because it was uncomfortable to breastfeed when you had a corset. Okay, so that was number one. And then the second thing was, at least when you're getting to the early 19th century, we're dealing with that kind of, was it Rousseau, right, Susan, that we were talking about? Back to nature, and women being encouraged to breastfeed their children. It was healthier. And you even see caricatures of upper class ladies, stoically enduring the breastfeeding because it's the right thing to do. But I didn't see anything that had to do with the discomfort of the corsets.
No.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that it's a certain amount of birth control. Certainly not infallible, but if you're nursing, you're less likely to have regular periods and to get pregnant again. So I think that too, people, not everybody wanted 1,000 kids, but they, so if they could sort of spread that out by a couple of years by doing this, it's it's just one other thing that you could do.
I mean, it's like the thing where for a period of time, women were bottle feeding their children. And that was like the normal thing to do. And then some attitudes changed, and they started saying, well, it's much healthier. Women were being told that it was much healthier to breastfeed their children than to bottle feed their children. And so you come to this thing of personal decisions. And I feel it's more like that for an earlier time period, where you're getting advice from various sources, and you might have your own ideas about things, and then you make your decision based on whatever, like maybe your mother's harassing you and says, no, you have to breastfeed your children. Or maybe you feel like it's not healthy to do that and it's better to send your child out. Or maybe you're too sickly to breastfeed your child. I don't think I have trouble when I hear blanket statements about this sort of thing.
And again, it's one of those things too, that again, it's the money. And babies that I know in London, there's all this horrific stuff about sending the babies out to baby farms in the country. And most of those babies don't survive because no one is supervising them or anything. It's this kind of this unwanted children thing. So I don't know, there's a lot. I think there's a lot that needs to be discussed more about that.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated subject.
Yeah. Don't
So
blame the horses.
Just going back to Queen Charlotte one more time, because I have seen it twice and had a conversation about a program about it last week. So she was not, in the story, she was not close to her children. And they said to her, like, we're not, we're not close to you. And so was that sort of a class thing? I mean, talking about breastfeeding, that's something that a lot of moms say, this made me feel closer to my children. So in terms of like, that sense of closeness, was it a class thing where, people that didn't have money were more likely to breastfeed, as somebody who did have money could get maybe a wet nurse or somebody to come and take care of them, and then that affected their relationships?
I think royalty in general, that's a whole different level, because you're trying to preserve the crown and preserve the children and raise them up to be kings and stuff. So I don't think anybody was really expecting. I know the scene you were talking, the children are terrible in that show.
I heard they were actually, it was very much in the real thing was that she did have 13 children and they didn't have children for a long, long time. So there was a lot of stress there. So yeah.
But they really lay it on.
Yeah.
In there. But I don't know, Loretta. I mean, my sense is that in royal families, the children are all going to be raised by somebody else. And
Yes.
I think in upper class families, even if it's not a wet nurse, there's going to be a nanny, there's going to be somebody else taking care of your children. Because again, you can afford it. You don't have to get up in the middle of the night. But in lower families who can't afford or don't choose to have a nanny, that's not going to be the way. I think children are, if you need help, it's going to be somebody else in your neighborhood, a family member, older siblings. If you may have gotten married when you were 17, but you have a 15-year-old sister and she'll come help you out. I mean, there's a lot more of the families, I think, looking after people when you're not nobility.
I just want to point out Lisa's comment that her friend binge watched Queen Charlotte after our discussion last week. So I feel successful. I made it.
Well, I thought that they did a good job with all the madness and I thought that they really
sobbing at least twice, sobbing. But yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about like how relationships happened back in the day and in reality versus like the things that we read about, because in the things we read about, like if you look at the Bridgertons, like they all got along really, really well for the most part. Did that actually happen? Of course, because people are humans, right?
Yeah, some families did, some families didn't. Then you're going to get different relationships. There's some couples that got together only because they had to preserve the land or the title or whatever, and then they don't like each other that much. As soon as they produce the heir, they go on their separate lives. But there's other people who are very fond of the person they ended. Lots of love matches. So
yeah. Whereas, I mean, I'm Indian, so like we do have arranged marriages, and so similar to what people talk about is that you learn to love the person that you're with. I mean, obviously there are people that you will never love because they're terrible, but in general, you can generally find something that you can appreciate about the other person.
Yeah, and very often when the marriages are being arranged, whatever time period or culture you're talking about, most of the time the parents are looking out for the best arrangement for their children, and they're trying to make sure they're compatible one way or another. You do have very materialistic marriages, and those can be deeply unhappy, but I keep reading about these marriages where they were the time period I'm writing in, where it's like love matches are much more normal. Well, yeah, they marry, they're madly in love, and then horrible things happen. They don't get along, and they're miserable, and there's abuse, and there's alcoholism or whatever. So there are no guarantees. The arranged marriage might work beautifully. People come to love each other. A marriage that's very for practical matters. Someone needs a husband because, like the Bennett girls, they're desperate. But it works out nicely, and in other cases it doesn't. Marriage is a gamble, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, there's lots of people who marry. In the past, you married for security too. You married. Almost nobody stayed widowed, if either men or women, because the men wanted someone to raise their children or look after their house or look after them, and the women needed the security of somebody who was looking after their money and was taking care of them too, and just the companionship. So that you seldom see people who are, who choose to remain single if they lose a spouse. And you also see the ones where the man is a tradesman, he dies, and his widow marries the apprentice to sort of keep the knowledge and the shop and stuff together. People get married for all different reasons. Then as now.
It's true. Well, I have to say that fake engagement is one of my catnip. So that's
great.
I do enjoy this part of the conversation. If you have just another minute to stay, Christy has one last question. Do you think that the dramatizations of Jane Austen novels have given an authentic impression of the Regency period?
I guess it depends which ones.
Because some are much better than others. I think people tend to think that they're much more representative. When you see these beautiful people in big, beautiful houses and they're out in the country and everything is lovely and sunny and stuff, and that's a very tiny part of English society that's living like that. And there's also, and at the same time as a lot of that's going on, there's what amounts to a world war going on, and you never hear any of that. And most of those, there may be handsome soldiers come parading by to go to the ball, but you don't see anybody who's come back with one arm or anything. I mean, and I think Jane Austen herself, because they're military people in her family, is very aware of that, but that's all kind of edited out in most of the movies.
Interesting. Loretta, any last thoughts on that?
I think it's, it's Hollywood or the BBC or whoever is making the show. They have a vision that they want to communicate, and it's their vision of the story. And I think some of them, for me, work better because I feel they're more historically accurate. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I don't want to denigrate a great story or great storytelling just because it's not historically accurate. It might make me crazy because I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's bad.
I mean, I enjoyed Queen Charlotte, but there's all sorts of stuff, the costumes and the hair and everything, which are the way the people talk. It's just sort of like, but if you just kind of suspend that, it's a good story. As you said, it's very poignant. You cry. But it's not giving you a good impression of Georgian England at all.
Mm-hmm. So, that's interesting. Yeah. It didn't even occur to me because for so many reasons, but, and I think that's why I love historical romance and all kinds of, historical fiction, because, it does take me away while also teaching me, things. So it's interesting to have these conversations to find out where I was led astray by them as well. Because I always thought, oh, I know history plenty because I've read these books, but it's just fascinating.
Well, it's also that no matter how much you research everything, we can never write about exactly. We don't know what happened.
Yeah.
We don't know. And that changes all the time. If you read a history book that was written in the 50s or the 60s, the 70s, 80s, and then compared to, what we know now, none of us know.
Yeah, constantly learning. I mean, there were things I put into my earlier books that I would now not do because I've learned about whatever that topic was. I've learned more.
Wow. Well, to me, your books are perfect, both of you. So I don't do anything with them. So thank you so much for this. This is, number 4, another, out of the ballpark kind of thing. Everybody's really enjoying it. I really, truly appreciate all the thought that you put into these meetings. I know it's sort of like off the cuff, but like, I can ask anything. So you always have these amazing answers to everything I ask. I appreciate it. And of course,
thank you for having us, Mina.
Yeah. You're a great host.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I will definitely be sending an email saying, when can we do this again? Soon.
That's fine. We're fine with that. It's much easier than writing a blog.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. So I am doing you all a service. You're welcome. Well, I look forward to your future books. Susan, just really quick, what are you coming up with next?
Martha Washington should come out next year, and after that I can't say yet because I haven't sold it yet. It's because I'm working on proposals, but it's going to be, I hope, a really good book. I can't say who it is yet.
So, I saw the cover of Martha. It's gorgeous. So you all look for it. Yeah. How about you, Loretta?
Well, I'm still working on the same one that I've been working on, but it seems to be coming along. So I have hopes of finishing it this year.
Well, so do we. All right. Well, have a wonderful night. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here and all of your great questions and chat and everything that really makes it so fun. So have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.